the Financial Survival Network, helping you to survive and thrive in the new economy. Get our complimentary newsletter at financialsurvivalnetwork.com. This is the Financial Survival Network.
This show is brought to you by jasonhartman.com. When it comes to investing, you need a balanced portfolio: gold, silver, and real estate. Jason is a master at helping you build a real estate portfolio that throws off positive cash flow, gives you incredible tax benefits, and a high return on investment. Go to jasonhartman.com. That's Jason, Hartman.com. You are listening to the FinancialSurvivalNetwork.com. I'm Kerry Lutz on 1590 WPSL. You know, I've been doing this a while. You've been listening to the Financial Survival Network. I always feel like I'm looking down. So now I've got somebody on here who's going to help you look up to see what's going on up there in the wild blue. NASA expert Rod Pyle talk about the 40th anniversary of Skylab, the International Space Station, and a whole bunch more. Rod, welcome to the Financial Survival Network.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So what's going on in space here? NASA's kind of like almost dropped off the radar, as it were. There, you know, the shuttle's gone, and we got some space plane flying around there, the X-51, I think it is. And
yeah.
What's going on with that? Anything you know about the X-51?
Well, I don't know much about that because it's a highly secretive program, but it's working and it's doing what they want, and that's the thing that's important. It's the smaller unmanned kind of a cross between a space shuttle and what's called a lifting body, which flies more on its shape than on the actual wing surface. So it's something they've been researching for a long time. This is kind of the latest iteration. But when you say what's going on, that's a really interesting question because people in the space community have been asking themselves what NASA's planning for about a year and a half now, and we're still kind of scratching our heads. They've got a kind of a general outline of a plan they've announced, but it kind of waffles around a bit. So that's a hard question to answer.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, one thing I forgot all about Skylab, and I remember when it crashed to Earth and people were all worried, is it going to, come in my living room? And yeah. I can't believe it's been 40 years. I mean, isn't that amazing?
It really is, and it's about as amazing as it's been more than 40 years since we walked on the moon. I mean, sometimes I see films from that era, and I have to pinch myself and say, not only did we do that, but we did that with this ancient aerospace technology. The computer was 36K, which is a tenth the amount of data that one of those old plastic floppy disks would hold. I mean, it was an incredible accomplishment at the time. And it's still hard to do now. I mean, we have trouble, as you mentioned at the opening of the show, we have trouble getting ourselves up to orbit. We have to hitch rides with the Russians right now. So space is tough. And the fact that they're able to do in 1973 what remains to this day the largest single volume space station in history is really a remarkable accomplishment.
Yeah, and basically not using much more than glorified slide rules. And, Rod, I think about that too when you look at old bridges that have been standing for 100 years. You go into New York, you look at the Brooklyn Bridge, the GW Bridge, all those bridges that connect Manhattan to other states and boroughs. And they didn't have computers. They were literally using slide rules, the primitive computer of the day. And yet they over-engineered these things. They built them so well and almost to perfection that it really makes you really shake your head and wonder the things that could be done without technology, without high tech.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and people often forget that. I mean, I live on the West Coast, so I occasionally drive over the Golden Gate Bridge or the Bay Bridge, which had its earthquake issues a few years back, but the engineering was sound. And you look at those things that were kind of done, as you said, with a glorified seat-of-the-pants approach, but they were sort of over-engineered. But you realize when you start looking at the history of them, I did a documentary on bridges years ago, oddly, and a lot of it was kind of almost an art form. Those early great engineers that did those structures and designed the Titanic and the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building and things like that, there was a real art in that may not be there now. I mean, I think what we do now is wonderful, and it's great to have the technology to be able to refine it to the nth degree like we do, but I sometimes wonder if a little bit of the artistry is kind of seeped out of it because it can, you know?
Yeah, and the whole thing of building big structures, huge projects, which was really an American thing. I mean, the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, all those things. Now with computers, it's just click and instant bridge. So yeah, the art, it's kind of out of it, but there's still some good bridges, good-looking bridges going up in the world for sure. And the space, the heavens, we're there. I mean, and we're going to stay there in one way or another, one form or another. Maybe the emphasis on manned flight is less than it used to be, but there's still a lot of things going up there, like the International Space Station.
Yeah, and it's, I think, important to remember when you're talking along these lines that, space is one of those things, other than software and entertainment and weapon systems, space is one of the few things we do better than anybody else on the planet. I mean, there's a lot of things we do very, very well, but space exploration and space technology stands head and shoulders above what other countries have accomplished. Now, it's ironic to be saying that while we're flying to our own space station in Russian spacecraft, but that was a voluntary decision to give up the shuttle, which, for better or worse, was an aging system that was kind of dangerous, and it was really expensive. One thing that doesn't get mentioned much when people are talking about, we're hitching rides to the Russians and those cranky old spacecraft of theirs. They've been refining the Soyuz spaceship since the early 60s when they were designing it. That was going to be their moon ship to beat us to the moon, and they failed miserably at that task. But they've been refining it ever since then, and it's pretty cheap. We pay $65 million per seat to get an astronaut up to our space station. We're paying most of the cost of their flight. The shuttle, to take up 6 or 7 guys, cost, on an amortized basis, $1.5 billion per flight. So as nice as it was to have our own way of getting up there and back, it was clearly time for something else. And in the interim, we just have to hitchhike a little bit.
Yeah, and what about...
It's uncomfortable, but it's there.
Hey, and like you said, they got it down. Cheaper labor and a proven technology makes it a lot easier. But what about private space in the U.S.? That's really taken off, hasn't it?
Oh, my God. I just got back from 3 conventions in the space of less than a month, and most of them are centering on that because finally, I was involved in the grassroots movement around private space in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was interesting, but there wasn't much going on. It was a lot of people talking about, I'm going to design a spaceship in my garage, and not much happened. Well, now some of those same people have finally done it. You've got newcomers in the field like Elon Musk, who pretty much single-handedly turned that whole thing upside down and said, you know what, I'm going to build my own space program because I can. And a lot of people thought he was nuts. And he did it, as so often happens with these kind of pioneers, right? I mean, you can go back to the turn of the 19th to 20th century, and they thought people were crazy that tried these kind of engineering feats. So he's built rockets. They appear to be perfectly safe. They're going to be man-rated in probably around 18 months to 2 years. And they'll start flying people to the space station, which is wonderful because that's really how it works best. There's other companies. There's a company called X-Core that's got this little space plane called the Lynx. It's going to start powered testing in the next few months here. And that's a single stage suborbital, takes off like a jet, goes up, lets you be weightless for 20 minutes or so, maybe 10 minutes, I can't remember. And then you come on down and you land on a runway, a little bit like the whole Virgin Galactic thing. So they're making great strides, and it's, mostly coming from the minds of highly motivated and very skilled individuals that are founding and operating these small companies, usually on a pretty thin margin. And that's something that we do very well.
Yeah, well, I guess private space has come a long way since Goddard was started the whole space mission, right? Effectively, he really was the forerunner of everything. Werner von Braun, the whole German space program, NASA.
Poor Goddard.
Yeah.
Here's a guy in Germany and in Russia. Rocket scientists were put on pedestals, and they were worshipped and catered to, and people gave them free meals everywhere. They went and all this. And then here's Robert Goddard in the U.S. a little bit before that, sending up his little rockets. People are making fun of him. There was this nasty article, I think it was in the New York Times, when he was trying to publicize his flight, saying, well, we all know that rockets can't go in space because there's nothing to push against out there. And done their basic physics homework. And people made fun of the guy, and he was very sensitive. You know, he's a professor. And he kind of pulled into being a recluse, and he did probably a tenth of what he could have accomplished if he had been given the kind of support that people were giving some of those, the foreign scientists. But, you know, those are countries that were more socialized than we were, and they supported that kind of thing. So it's a trade-off, right? In the United States, you got to be kind of rough and ready and a pioneer type. And if you are, you can accomplish things here that you can't do anywhere else in the world. On the other hand, if you're a sensitive introvert professor who's designing and flying your own rockets, then he might have done better in Germany. But as it worked out, those three lines of thinking and research, the U.S., Germany, and the Soviet Union, now Russia, came together over the years. And as you know, after World War II, you know, we grabbed half the German rocket scientists, and the Russians grabbed the other half of the German rocket scientists and brought them over to help us finish our program. And it ended up being a wonderful combination. And now all three of those lines have converged in the space station, and it works pretty well.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about that right now. We just word from our sponsor. This show is brought to you by JasonHartman.com. I'm looking into real estate investing now. Probably not a bad idea for you as well. Go to JasonHartman.com, Jason, HartMan.com, and tell him Kerry sent you. And we're back. And speaking of misunderstood technological giants, scientists who are so far ahead of their time, you can't really have that discussion without talking about Nikola Tesla, can you?
Well, talk about misunderstood. Yeah, he was an amazing guy. And he's another one of those scientists, as you say, he's misunderstood and under-rewarded. And unfortunately, towards the end of his life, got to be very quirky and kind of odd. And I think it made it harder for people to work with him and support him that would have done so. Although, you know, Westinghouse was pretty good to Tesla, at least initially, and they had a good working relationship and ended up beating Edison in his own game in the electrical business, certainly.
Yeah, and that was totally due to Tesla's work. In the process now of listening to this book on Audible, I love audiobooks, and Audible is the best, and it's called Wizard, and it's an amazing book because it's a huge book. It must have been 1,500 pages, and they went into the National Archives. They did Freedom of Information Request forms, act forms, to get these documents, a lot of them which had been classified up until very recently, and they talked to a lot of people who knew him or whose family members were involved with him. And the story that comes out about the guy, you know, you thought you knew a lot about him, that pretty much AC, the generator, power lines, everything that you can imagine dealing with today's electrical system was this guy. And I know we're going a little afield from space, but you know, you do get these misunderstood, underappreciated geniuses, unlike Edison, where, you know, Tesla worked for Edison for a while, and he said if Edison was actually an engineer, he could have accomplished so much more than he actually did, because he would just try everything, and an engineer has the knowledge to narrow down the possibilities. And
right.
You know, he's just an amazing guy that really, you know, you look at these brilliant guys and sometimes they just are out of step with humanity. They're so far ahead and, you know, they're really just outliers.
Well, and I think that's an excellent set of points. And also with Edison, the guy was a serious hustler. I mean, to try and push back against Westinghouse and Tesla with their obviously superior now alternating current, Edison set up the whole idea of electrocution of criminals. Yeah. And the first couple of times they did it, they kept running voltage to the guy, and he refused to die, and it was really grim. And at that point, most of us would say, okay, this is a bad idea, I give, but not Thomas Edison. He kept after it. So he's an amazing guy, but a little bit of a hustler in there.
Oh, yeah. He knew how to promote, and perhaps that was the difference between him and Tesla, is that knowledge of business. And don't forget, Edison went bankrupt twice, once on movies, I think the second on the phonograph. And after that, he was determined never to go bankrupt again. Yeah, one of the most amazing things that you can do if you come to the East is go to the Edison Labs in Orange, New Jersey. I did it as a kid, took my kids there a few years back, and you really get a feel. Science was so primitive then, they didn't really know what they were doing. Their knowledge of physics and just the way electricity worked, its properties, was so narrow. And yeah, of course, AC was better than DC. We know that now. It goes longer distances, more efficient, a lot of pluses to it. But back then, they didn't know what the heck they were doing, pretty much. And Tesla knew, and nobody else knew. That was the amazing thing about it.
Well, then you look at the flights into the unknown that he took, like that, I think it was upstate New York, wasn't it, where he built that big tower to test out his huge Tesla coil, which I think somebody's restoring now. I mean, what a fantastic and crazy idea. There were farmers, I was reading an article about this years ago, there were farmers miles away who would reach over to pick up their steel milk can while that thing was running, and they'd get a jolt about a foot long, so it had some issues. Wires work better than transmitting it through the air, and of course, no utility, neither Edison nor Westinghouse, is going to be thrilled with the idea of free electricity for all, but the man was clearly a visionary, and it would have been interesting if he had applied himself to spaceflight. Yeah.
Hey, well, can't do everything in life, right?
Well, that's true, limits. But we try. We have to try.
Absolutely. So more on getting back to space, more heavenly. What about the mission to Mars? Is there any progress being made on that?
Well, interestingly, kind of what you were alluding to earlier, most of it is in the private sector. NASA is still planning, although, again, the plans of, since the cancellation of the Constellation program, which is the Return to the Moon program, anything beyond Earth orbit's a little iffy at this point. We're talking about asteroids, and if you can go to an asteroid and do your thing out there, then it's easy to go to the moons of Mars because they're a little further, but they're still outside any big gravity well. You're not landing. Then once you've done that, you can maybe set up shop and decide you're going to send a lander down the Martian surface. So the Orion capsule, which is the replacement for the shuttle that looks a lot like a larger Apollo capsule but is more sophisticated, is rated to be able to do that as long as you've got some extra habitability space on the way out to Mars. Meanwhile, private industry, there's two people that have entered that space, if you will, recently. One is Inspiration Mars, which is Dennis Tito, and he was one of the first space tourists, and he's setting up a program to try and send two people, a couple, preferably married, male and female, to do a loop around Mars. It's about 16 months, and it's strictly a flyby. It's a big figure eight. So in all that time, you're going to spend 10 hours transiting the backside of Mars and come home. That was studied by NASA back in the 60s as a follow-on to the Apollo program, but they decided that there just weren't enough rewards to make it worthwhile. Dennis Tito's view is I'm not looking for a scientific return. I'm looking to inspire people and say we need to get off our butts and get this program moving, and this is how I'm going to do it. And I'm putting $100 million of my own money into it. He'll need more, but that's a start. Then there's a guy in Holland named Bas Lansdorp who's putting together this Mars One program. And I don't think, most people who understand this stuff don't think he's got nearly as good a chance as Tito, but his idea is to send people on one-way colonization missions and send 3 or 4 of them every 2 years and gradually build up a colony on Mars, but strictly a one-way ticket.
Yeah, how close are we to any of this?
Well, the Dennis Tito thing, the Inspiration Mars flyby, if he could get the money, he could start putting this thing together tomorrow. The Dragon capsule from SpaceX would probably work. There's a company called Bigelow that makes inflatable habitats you can use in space that they could use to have a little extra living room. The life support issues have been worked out on submarines for decades. So really the only issue is money and figuring out how to shelter the crew from radiation on the way out and the way back. And then the psychological factors. The other one, the colony thing, they've got a lot of work to do. I mean, they're basically a couple of guys in an office in Holland, and he's got a lot of money behind him, but not enough to do that. I mean, you're talking $4 to $6 billion per flight, and he's got, a handful of $1 million. So he has a long way to go.
All starts with a dream, though, and that's what you always got to remember. If you didn't have the dream, you wouldn't be there.
That's true. And, I've got those same dreams. I just find it a little easier to do the writing because I don't have to call as many rich people to get my budget put together. But I certainly admire these guys. At the last conference I was at, I met a guy, Robert Godwin, who's got a company that's flown biological research packages on the space station, and they're doing more of that. And they figured out, this is very interesting, and it's an amazing thing. It's a bit oblique to what we're talking about, but this is a good example of what private space does really well. They figured out that if you take certain kinds of cells, and they're using plant cells for this right now, and put them up in 0G, all that junk DNA that we've never quite figured out why it's there on the double helix, when you put that cell up in orbit in a microgravity environment where it's never been since the time it was, first appeared on the planet, all those extra pieces in the DNA turn on, and it starts going basically in a hyperdrive, and you can make these things much more robust, and you could it's not genetic engineering really, but you sort of force them in a certain direction to evolve in certain ways. So when they come back to Earth, there's one example that he's talking about of a plant that can, I think per hectare, it can deliver something like 6 tons of high-grade fuel, basically like kerosene. When you put it up into space and bring it back, the changes that take place allow it to grow in almost any temperature environment as opposed to only in places that are equatorial. When you think about that with regard to these developing countries that have a lot of farmland but no real product, that's a big deal, and that's strictly private space. The only government cooperation was getting it up to the space station and back, but the operation and the idea and the marketing and exploitation of it is all being done by a private company. So a lot's happening right now.
Let me just get that clear. So you take a plant that functions pretty normally, you bring it up to space in zero gravity, and all of a sudden all these genes basically kick in, and it becomes prolific, major production, and then you can bring it back down to Earth and it still produces like that, or you have to produce up in space?
No, it still produces like that. It doesn't revert as long as it stays up there. I think they figured general terms something like 90 days. Wow. And then they're looking at doing similar work with stem cells and being able to grow larger colonies of very robust stem cells and bring them back. And I don't understand the biology behind that very well, but they're able to come back and do a lot of things they couldn't do before they left Earth. This is one of those things that 5 or 10 years ago wasn't even an inkling on anybody's radar, or if it was, it hadn't been tried yet. And you look at this now and you say, okay, now I see a real argument for being up there. For years, people like me and NASA PR and so forth have been trying to say it's good to be in space. And people say, why? And you go, well, because it's really cool and man must explore. Well, when you can come back with a real economic benefit, so you've got stuff like that. You've got the people that are now going to go out to the asteroids. There's incredible resources in the asteroids, both for bringing back to Earth and for using out there. Because when you think about it, if you launch a gallon of water from Earth to orbit for use up there, that's pretty heavy, and that's probably $1 million of water, a couple of gallons.
Sure.
But when you can mine it off an asteroid out of pure ice, some of the cleanest water in the solar system, now you've got a real resource. You can make an air, rocket fuel, drinking water, all kinds of things. And there's at least 2 companies, probably 3, working on that pretty aggressively. So I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see a lot of progress in this area, and it's very exciting.
It is amazing, and that sounds like a major breakthrough too, Rod. Anyway, we got to take off now, but people want to find out more about you, get your books. Where did they go?
My books are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and everywhere else. Just search my name, Rod Pyle, and I've got a website at rodpylebooks.com.
All right. Excellent. And go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Get the latest information, what's going on in the real financial world, not what they're telling you out there. Don't forget Liberty Mastermind Symposium, libertymastermind.us, June 28th, 29th in Dallas, Texas. It's going to be a great time with 15 major thought leaders. Rod, we'll talk to you again soon, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
The Financial Survival Network, helping you to survive and thrive in the new economy. Get our complimentary newsletter at financialsurvivalnetwork.com. This is the Financial Survival Network.